Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a place that feels both alien and oddly familiar. You're standing under the heavy twilight of the Nile Valley, and the air hums with the sound of insects and chatter, merchants calling out their wares in voices that echo off mud brick walls. Oil lamps flicker, and the smell of roasted fish, honey cakes, and something you can't quite identify, possibly goat, hangs in the air. You wander into the heart of an ancient Egyptian market where every sense is tugged awake even though you came here to drift into sleep. You see baskets piled with onions, figs, and strange spices that will tickle your nose. Someone behind you jostles past, muttering in a language you don't know, and for a moment you realize, without some kind of list, without some scratchings of symbols, you'd never keep track of what you were meant to buy. You'd come home with a jar of honey and forget the grain. And then, frankly, you probably wouldn't survive this week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along rows of traders who arrange their produce in neat pyramids that look suspiciously like, well, pyramids. The Egyptians were very into shapes. Even their piles of onions look like miniature monuments. The sun has just dipped, and the heat is fading, replaced by a dusty breeze carrying both the sweet and sour odors of daily survival. A vendor thrusts a bunch of leeks toward you, shouting their price. You think back to your fridge at home. Imagine trying to run it without sticky notes or fridge magnets. The Egyptians, clever as they were, faced that same problem in a world where everything was perishable and chaotic. Markets in Egypt weren't just neighborhood spots. They were the lifeblood of the entire society. Here, grain wasn't just food, it was currency. Beer wasn't simply a beverage, it was a wage. You notice families haggling for bread loaves, while others carry bundles of papyrus stalks. You might smile at the irony that the very plant used for record keeping was also traded in the very places that made those records necessary. Point one mainstream fact to anchor you here. These markets clustered near the Nile, especially after the annual flood. When the river retreated, fertile soil turned into bursting harvests, and markets sprang alive with surplus. Without markets, without exchange, the pharaoh's grand construction projects would have ground to a halt. No statues, no temples. And yet, there's a quirk, almost a fringe tidbit. You'd occasionally find crocodile dung sold here. Yes, crocodile dung, pressed into medicinal concoctions or even used as a bizarre form of birth control. Imagine scribbling that onto your shopping list. Eggs, onions, crocodile dung. Don't forget. Suddenly, forgetting the milk doesn't seem so bad. You weave deeper into the crowd, hearing the slap of sandals on packed earth. Everywhere, people shout numbers, or rather the Egyptian equivalent of them, bargaining and tallying in their heads. But imagine when a family bought grain one week and forgot how much was left the next, or when a temple official demanded precise tribute, but couldn't remember last month's delivery. Chaos would reign, which is why lists, primitive at first, emerged not as luxuries, but as survival tools. Historians still argue whether markets like this lean more on barter or on some proto-currency system. Was it always goods for goods, or did shiny rings of copper and little weights of silver grease the trade? Nobody can fully agree, and maybe you chuckle. Thousands of years later, and scholars still sound like two neighbors bickering over whether tomatoes belong in fruit salad. You stop by a booth where a man carefully counts out bread loaves. His lips move silently as he tallies. His assistant scratches a mark onto a shard of pottery, a simple note. 5 loaves gone, 10 left. It's not papyrus, but it's something. The fragment will be tossed later, but for now, it's the only way. They remember. This, you realize, is the seed of your modern grocery receipt. Your feet ache from wandering, so you pause at a stall selling dates. The vendor thrusts a handful at you, sticky and sweet, and suddenly you understand why a written list matters. How else do you avoid temptation? You came for onions, but the dates smell irresistible. That was as true then as it is when you grab just one extra snack at the store. The sky darkens. Oil lamps burn brighter. The murmur of voices fades into a rhythmic drone, like the fan you hopefully have by your bed. You notice one last thing: a boy trailing after his mother, tugging at her sleeve, demanding a toy carved from wood. She shakes her head, pulls a scrap of papyrus, and mutters through her list. No toys today. Groceries only. Some struggles never change. You shuffle along the dusty street, and suddenly the marketplace feels more crowded, more frantic. The stalls are bursting with onions, fish, barley, even a jug of something that smells suspiciously like sour beer. People jostle against you, shouting prices, and you realize how quickly it all unravels without any record of who owes what. Imagine bartering a jug of beer for a sack of grain, only to forget which neighbor promised to bring you goats tomorrow. The next day, he swears he never agreed, and you're left staring at empty hands. The Egyptians lived in a barter economy for centuries, and while it sounds charming, like some neighborly swap meet, barter is, honestly, a logistical nightmare. You stand there watching one woman haggle. She's offering bread for salt. The salt seller wants flax, and the flax grower only takes honey. You wait as they all argue, and the minutes stretch. This is the chaos before lists, before written accounts, when everything depended on someone's memory. And memories, as you know, are slippery things. Here's a solid fact. Before writing took hold, the Egyptians, like Mesopotamians, relied heavily on oral agreements and tally sticks. Grain stored in communal silos was counted by marks scratched into wood, stone, or pottery. It worked for a time, but when harvests grew bigger and trade webs stretched further, the system cracked under its own weight. You can almost see those harried farmers, palms sweaty, trying to remember how many jars of beer they owed to which neighbor after the last harvest. Then there's the quirky tidbit. You might not know that in early bartering Egypt, people sometimes used dried fish as a unit of exchange. Yes, actual fish, which, let's be real, doesn't exactly age well in the desert heat. You imagine pulling one out of your satchel a week later, slimy and buzzing with flies, trying to convince a skeptical vendor that it still counts as payment. Good luck. The longer you watch the scene, the more tangled it becomes. One man storms off because someone shortchanged him a handful of lentils. Another swears loudly that his neighbor borrowed a goose and never gave it back. You can feel the tension simmering. This barter web is fragile. People are human. They forget, they exaggerate, they lie. Historians still argue whether barter really dominated daily Egyptian markets or if a shadow of currency, rings of copper, little measured weights, existed far earlier. Some say barter was king until writing came along. Others insist that even in the Old Kingdom, silver and copper trickled into trade quietly. No one can prove it either way, and it leaves you with the sense that Egyptian markets were probably a messy blend of both. The air around you thickens with voices. You picture yourself, hungry and tired, clutching a jug of beer you just swapped for onions, and then someone insists you didn't pay enough. You argue, they argue, and soon a small crowd gathers. Someone suggests fetching a scribe, though. He's expensive, to write it down, to settle the matter. You see the glimmer. Lists are not born from abstract genius. They're forged out of petty squabbles over onions and beer. You wander to a quieter corner where a small family spreads their goods on a reed mat. A child counts jars of oil, carefully stacking them, muttering numbers. The father frowns, confused. Was it 7 jars or 6? The boy shrugs. Already, the need for something more permanent is obvious. You almost want to hand them a notepad from your pocket, but then you remember, it hasn't been invented yet. The chaos presses in again. A man holds up a clay token, marked with scratches. It represents a debt owed, grain to be delivered after harvest. But someone else laughs and says the token looks fake. You realize how fragile trust is without an official system. This token could mean everything or nothing depending on who's telling the story. And here's where you chuckle. The Egyptians weren't the only ones facing this. Imagine your own daily bartering. 1 coffee for 2 muffins, a car wash for mowing the lawn. Without notes, without receipts, friendships would dissolve quickly. It's not that humanity is greedy. It's that humanity is forgetful. You walk past another stall, and the smell of fresh bread fills your lungs. A baker argues heatedly with a brewer, both shouting about whether yesterday's payment covered 2 loaves or 3. The baker insists 3, the brewer swears it was 2. The crowd watches like it's free entertainment. And just when the fight might turn physical. A calm figure appears. A scribe, reed pen tucked behind his ear, papyrus under his arm. He doesn't need to speak. The sight of him silences the dispute. For the first time, you sense the order that list will bring. But not yet. For now, you're still in the middle of barter chaos. Your arms full of food you didn't mean to buy, your head aching from the noise. Somewhere in this madness, you can feel writing tugging at the edges, ready to arrive, to save everyone from their own forgetfulness. The air grows still for a moment, and you hear the rustle of reeds along the banks of the Nile. You've stepped away from the noisy barter chaos and wandered closer to the water. The river reflects the fading light, its surface turning copper, and then black as night creeps in. You notice workers cutting stalks of papyrus, their bronze knives flashing briefly as they slice through the tall green stems. This is the moment when the chaos of barter begins to meet the calm of invention. The very birth of writing surfaces. You squat down beside a bundle of cut stalks. A man peels away the outer rind with steady hands, revealing the pale pith inside. He slices it into strips, lays them crosswise, presses them under stone, and suddenly, something thin, flexible, and oddly modern-looking appears. Papyrus. You run your fingers across it. It's rough yet smooth, a texture meant to endure. These sheets, humble as they look, will carry the first shopping lists, temple inventories, and royal decrees. Without this plant, pharaohs would be shouting in the markets just like everyone else. Here's the historical anchor. Papyrus was developed in Egypt as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, and for centuries it became the writing surface of choice across the Mediterranean. Lightweight, portable, far superior to carving on stone or scratching on pottery. It let scribes write faster, longer, and cheaper. The Greeks, the Romans, everyone would later crave it, but it was Egypt's invention first, and here's a quirky tidbit that might make you smile. Papyrus sheets weren't always fresh and new. Sometimes scribes recycled older documents, scraping off faded ink and reusing the surface. Imagine buying groceries and realizing your list is written on the back of an old tax notice. It's the ancient equivalent of jotting your shopping on the back of junk mail. Efficient, yes, but also slightly insulting. As you stand watching, the workers stack fresh papyrus sheets, tying them with reed cords. Children chase each other along the banks, their laughter carrying over the water. One boy grabs a scrap of discarded stalk and pretends it's a pen, scribbling invisible words in the air. You can't help but think, this boy is glimpsing the future. Historians still argue whether papyrus was invented primarily for practical record-keeping, like lists and inventories, or for ritual and religious purposes. Was the first sheet filled with grain tallies or with hymns to Ra? No one truly knows. Some scholars insist the temple priests had first claim. Others believe the scribes serving farmers and merchants got there earlier. It's a debate that will never resolve, and maybe that's fine. It means you can imagine either the grandeur of gods or the banality of onions, written down first. The smell of crushed reed lingers in your nose, sharp and grassy. You trail a hand through the papyrus bundles stacked to dry, and it feels oddly like touching stiff fabric. The thought hits you. This plant is the bridge between thought and memory, between fleeting speech and enduring word. Without it, shopping lists stay fragile whispers. With it, they become evidence, proof, a shield against forgetfulness. You stroll away from the riverside, carrying an imaginary blank sheet. The streets are quieter now, and the market stalls are closing. You pass a vendor who ties up his goods, muttering numbers under his breath. You imagine how much easier it would be if he had one of these sheets, a quick scratch of ink to capture his inventory. The knowledge makes you smirk. You're watching humanity invent post-it notes, only shinier and more sacred, but don't get too reverent. Picture the downside. Papyrus was expensive compared to scratching a note on a broken shard of pottery. Most people couldn't afford to waste it on daily errands. It was temples, officials, and scribes who dominated its use. Still, even one humble scrap used to jot 3 loaves, 1 jar of beer, changed everything. As the night deepens, the Nile glimmers, dotted with torchlight from fishing boats. Somewhere, in a nearby house, a scribe sits with fresh papyrus on his lap. He dips his pen into black ink made of soot and gum, and for the first time today, he writes down a list. Not for glory, not for the gods, but for sheer practicality. 1 goat, 2 sacks of barley, 4 jars of beer. A mundane miracle, the first shopping note. You breathe out slowly, feeling the calm settle in. The chaos of barter begins to fade behind you. Papyrus, simple and unassuming, has taken its place. Tomorrow's markets will look the same, but something invisible has shifted. Now there's memory outside the human brain, captured on reeds pressed flat, waiting to remind someone of the things they forgot. The papyrus sheets rustle softly in your hand as you drift further into the evening. Around you, the markets close, shutters creak, and the last torches sputter against the dark. But instead of following the crowd home, you find yourself drawn to a small, candlelit room tucked behind the noise of the city. Inside, a man leans over a low table, his back hunched, his fingers smudged with ink. This is a scribe, and you're about to see how lists transform from blank papyrus into living memory. The reed pen looks simple, almost fragile. It's nothing more than a sharpened stalk, its fibers split to hold ink. The ink itself is made of soot, gum, and water, a black so deep it gleams in the flicker of the lamp. With deliberate calm, the scribe dips, presses, and scratches. Each movement is careful, measured, as though the weight of Pharaoh's court might collapse if a single symbol went astray. The nib squeaks faintly against the papyrus, like the world's earliest ASMR. Here's your anchor fact. Scribes were the elite of Egypt. While most people never learned to write, scribes trained. For years in houses of life, schools attached to temples. They learned hundreds of hieroglyphs, then shorthand hieratic script, until their hands moved with both grace and speed. To be a scribe was to hold power, because in a society built on records, grain, taxes, workers, you were the one keeping everyone honest. Now the quirky tidbit. Scribes weren't just officials with stiff posture. Some carried reputations for sass. There are fragments where they scribbled jokes in the margins, tiny doodles of animals making rude faces or sarcastic comments about their supervisors. Imagine your accountant doodling a dancing cat at the bottom of your tax return. Not so. Different, really. You watch the scribe in this candlelit room, and he's not writing a hymn or decree. He's jotting something small. Jars of oil delivered, geese received, bread loaves promised. His lips move silently as he checks each line, as though he's muttering a mantra. You see how lists start humbly, not with kings, but with bakers, butchers, and brewers. Without them, nothing in this society would function. Historians still argue whether these early scribes served mostly temples and officials, or if they were already hired by ordinary merchants to keep track of everyday exchanges. Some evidence suggests papyrus sheets stored in archives were mostly about state control, taxes, labor. Others hint that shopping and household accounts slipped in too, almost invisibly. Was the first shopping list government paperwork disguised as daily life, or the other way around? You'll never know, but the mystery itself is oddly comforting. The smell of ink sharpens the air. The scribe pauses, wipes his reed pen, and scratches again. The sound is hypnotic. Dip, drag, lift. It's like listening to waves. You sit cross-legged nearby, eyelids heavy, but still curious. He pushes the papyrus toward you. You tilt your head and squint at the neat columns of hieratic symbols. And though you can't read them, you understand. This is someone's order, someone's reminder, someone's attempt not to forget. A small boy pokes his head into the room, whispering that his mother sent him to ask whether the family's bread order was ready. The scribe nods, points at a line on his sheet, and the boy grins. He trusts the ink more than the baker's memory. You realize what you're seeing isn't just a list. It's trust, bottled into symbols. The room grows warmer, the oil lamp flickers lower. You hear night sounds outside, a donkey braying, sandals scuffing, laughter carried on the breeze. The scribe stretches, his back cracking audibly, then writes a final note. 1 more jar of beer for tomorrow. He places the sheet gently in a basket, weighting it with a smooth stone. Done for the day. As you rise to leave, you glance once more at the reed pen. It doesn't look like much. Cheap, plant-made, nothing gold or jeweled. And yet, it's the tool that turned barter bickering into order, memory into permanence. You step outside, the cool night air hitting your skin, and you feel the faint satisfaction of knowing humanity just invented don't forget the milk. The night deepens, but your walk carries you toward the smell of something warm and familiar. A low fire glows ahead, and you catch sight of baskets stacked high with flat loaves of bread. Beside them, clay jugs of beer clink as workers haul them from carts. You're standing at the center of Egypt's daily diet, the economy of bread and beer, and without it, no list would make sense. After all, what's the point of scribbling notes if you don't know what you're scribbling about? Bread is everywhere. The air is thick with the scent of yeast and toasted grain. Loaves come in round, flat, conical shapes, and sometimes stuffed with dates or honey. Children gnaw on smaller rolls, while laborers tuck larger loaves into baskets to take with them at dawn. You grab one mentally and chew. It's dense, gritty, and filled with little flecks of stone from the grinding process. Not exactly sourdough Instagram material, but it fills your stomach. Beer, meanwhile, isn't what you know today. It's cloudy, thick, more like liquid porridge than crisp lager. It's brewed from crumbled bread soaked in water, left to ferment, then flavored with herbs. People sip it at breakfast, lunch, dinner. Workers are literally paid in beer, their wages measured not in coins but in daily rations of loaves and jars. You glance at a scribe's list resting nearby, and sure enough, it doesn't read dollars or shekels. It reads 300 loaves, 200 jars of beer. That's the currency here. Here's your grounded fact. Bread and beer were staples of the Egyptian diet for millennia, with ration lists proving their central role in everything from household survival to temple offerings. Archaeologists have uncovered countless papyrus fragments listing them, alongside drawings on tomb walls showing how they were made and distributed. If you wanted to survive, you needed both, and if you wanted to keep track of anything, you wrote them down first. Now for the quirky tidbit. Egyptians sometimes added odd ingredients to their beer, like dates or mandrake root. Some recipes even hint at psychotropic effects. You might call it ancient craft beer. Picture Pharaoh at a banquet sipping on something that made him giggle uncontrollably. If lists helped civilization stay orderly, beer may have been the equal and opposite force undoing it by night. Historians still argue whether beer and bread were truly nutritious enough to sustain heavy laborers, like those hauling stones for the pyramids. Some say the rations were sufficient. Others insist the workers must have supplemented with vegetables, fish, and fruit. Either way, the debate makes you glance at the crumbly loaf in your hand and the sludgy beer in your cup. You're not sure you'd last long on this diet, though it does sound suspiciously like a college student's pantry. The marketplace shifts in your ears. You hear the clatter of jars, the crackle of baking ovens, the rhythmic pounding of pestles grinding barley. All of it would be wasted effort without lists. Imagine one temple forgetting to record how many loaves they owed to another. Imagine a baker forgetting which households had paid. Chaos would spread like wildfire. Instead, you picture scribes jotting every delivery, every jar, every loaf. Lists anchor this bread and beer economy to reality. You lean against a mud brick wall, watching a worker carry a tally board. He scratches a quick mark for each loaf distributed, and soon the board fills with notches. He frowns, looks at the overflowing baskets, and sighs. This is the moment lists leap from scratch marks to full records. He needs more than lines. He needs words, symbols, reminders that last longer than a wooden tally. Your eyes wander upward to the star-studded sky. Imagine every loaf and jar as a star, scattered and countless. Without patterns, it's just chaos. But just as constellations bring order to the sky, lists bring order to food. Someone had to write it down, to say, these belong here, these belong there. And suddenly, feeding thousands of workers wasn't impossible anymore. A dog trots past, snagging a crust of bread from the ground, its tail wagging. You smile at the thought. Even scavengers benefit from the Egyptian list system. A loaf tallied but dropped is still a loaf. Maybe not the intended recipient, but life has its quirks. The fire dies lower. Families pack their loaves in woven baskets, shoulders stooped with the weight. Laborers line up to receive their beer jugs, names checked against neat papyrus columns. You watch, drowsy, as order prevails in the dim lamplight. Everyone gets their share, and no one argues, at least not tonight. The bread and beer lists have done their job. You turn away, your stomach comfortably heavy from imagined bread, your head buzzing faintly from thick beer. The night hums softly now, and with every step you feel the Egyptian's world slip closer to yours. After all, your own shopping lists probably begin the same way. Bread, something to drink, something sweet if you're lucky. The more things change, the more they stay written down. The temple fades behind you, and you drift toward a new sound. Hooves clattering, shouts echoing in the distance. Lanterns sway along the road, illuminating men in crisp linen kilts, carrying scrolls, reed pens tucked at their belts. These are Pharaoh's tax collectors, and suddenly the marketplace chatter feels less friendly. You step aside as the group passes, their eyes sharp, their movements brisk, as if every grain of barley in Egypt personally belongs to them. Your shoulders tense, though you know you have nothing to declare. The collectors stop at a farmer's house, and you watch as sacks of wheat are dragged out, weighed with stone balances, and meticulously recorded. The farmer bows, though his eyes flicker nervously. You feel the weight of bureaucracy pressing down. The list isn't just a memory aid now. It's a demand that here's the historical anchor. Tax in ancient Egypt was usually collected in kind, grain, cattle, linen, oil, rather than in coin. Records were everything. Pharaoh's administration stretched across hundreds of miles, and only by keeping detailed lists of what each household owed could the state keep its pyramids rising and its armies fed. Without these tax lists, the whole royal machine would sputter. Now the quirky tidbit: tax collectors weren't above a little creative adjustment. Some inscriptions show officials bragging about their accuracy, but ostraca, little pottery shards scribbled with complaints, reveal villagers, accusing them of inflating numbers. Imagine an ancient Yelp review. 1 star. Said I owed 10 jars of beer. I clearly only owed 8. You grin. Bureaucracy has always inspired muttered curses. Historians still argue whether Egyptian taxation was oppressive or relatively balanced. Some claim it was crushing, bleeding farmers dry to fund Pharaoh's monuments. Others suggest it was expected, even accepted, as part of the natural order. Pharaoh provided flood protection and divine favor, and taxes were his due. The truth probably lies somewhere between devotion and resentment, like paying modern bills, a mix of sighs and shrugs. You follow the collectors as they move along the street. At each stop, a scribe unrolls a papyrus scroll, smooths it flat on his knee, and scribbles neat hieratic notes. His reed pen scratches softly, grain weights, goat counts, oil jars. Each line locks a family's fate. The collectors murmur as they check the numbers against what's hauled into their carts. One farmer tries to argue, his voice cracking with desperation, but the scribe shakes his head, pointing at the list. Ink trumps memory, authority trumps plea. Your chest tightens with the atmosphere. Imagine the tension of knowing your years. Labor can be erased with one crooked symbol. A smudge of ink could mean starvation. And yet, for the collectors, the list is order, fairness, accountability. Without it, they'd be lost in arguments and protests that a boy watches from a doorway, wide-eyed, clutching a crust of bread. His mother hushes him, tugging him back inside. But you can see it in his eyes. He's already memorizing the image of pen on papyrus, the way authority lives in ink. Someday, he might become a scribe himself. The road narrows, and the collectors pass close enough for you to smell them: sweat, ink, dust, and the faint sweetness of beer. One man glances at you, suspicious, before turning away. You breathe out, relieved. You realize now that these lists aren't just tools for remembering groceries or wages. They're weapons, levers of power, silent and sharp. Still, you find humor even here. A donkey pulling one of the carts brays loudly, startling a collector. The man stumbles, spilling a handful of papyrus sheets into the dust. He curses as he gathers them up, brushing frantically at smudges. For a moment, the mighty bureaucracy teeters on the edge of absurdity. One donkey sneeze, and Pharaoh's precious lists almost blow away. The night grows quieter as the collectors fade into the distance, their torches bobbing like fireflies swallowed by darkness. You stand alone, heart slowing, head heavy. The ink on those scrolls will ripple across Egypt, feeding temples, fueling armies, building monuments. But to you, they're just reminders of how fragile control is. A list can feed you, or it can strip your house bare. The Nile wind brushes your face. You tilt your head back to the stars and think, without lists, chaos rules. With them, Pharaoh rules. Either way, you're caught in the middle, listening to the scratch of pens echoing in the night. The tax collectors disappear down the road, but you're still restless, following the trail of ink further back in time. You step into a dim chamber lit by a small fire pit, where low clay tables are scattered with little objects that look almost like toys. Smooth pebbles, carved cones, tiny tokens shaped like animals and jars. You kneel down and pick one up. It's cool in your hand, with a faint symbol scratched on its surface. At first it feels like a child's game, but then you realize, this is accounting, before ink, that you're holding a clay token, one of the earliest tools used to track goods. Each token represented something: one sheep, one jar of oil, one measure of grain. Instead of scribbling symbols, people carried pockets of these tokens and used them like receipts. A bag full of sheep tokens meant you owed someone sheep. A bag of bread tokens meant bread. Lists, before lists. Here's the historical anchor. Long before papyrus, tokens and tallies were used across the Near East, and Egyptians likely borrowed and adapted these practices. Eventually, the tokens weren't just carried, they were pressed into clay tablets to leave impressions, the beginnings of written numerals and symbols. This evolution laid the groundwork for hieroglyphs and hieratic script. Your shopping list didn't start as words. It started as pebbles in a pouch. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some tokens were shaped whimsically, like miniature loaves of bread or tiny goats. Imagine reaching into your pocket and pulling out a clay chicken token to prove you'd ordered poultry. Suddenly your shopping feels like playing with Monopoly pieces, except instead of fake rent money, you're holding your dinner. Historians still argue whether tokens were widely used in Egypt itself or whether they were primarily imported. Ideas from Mesopotamia. Some say Egypt preferred direct writing on ostraca, broken pottery shards, while others insist tokens must have circulated among early traders. The truth, as usual, is blurred. Egypt borrowed, tweaked, and sometimes ignored outside ideas, mixing them into something uniquely its own. You set the clay token back on the table. Around you, scribes in training sort piles of them, their brows furrowed in concentration. They drop a token into one bowl, then another, murmuring counts. To your ears, it sounds like dice rattling in a cup. But each rattle is a goat, a jug of oil, a loaf of bread. The rhythm lulls you, a soft percussion of civilization waking up. One boy yawns, his hand slipping, and suddenly he's dropped 2 tokens instead of 1. The master scribe scolds him sharply. You chuckle, one clumsy mistake, and someone might end up with double the goats they bargained for. No wonder writing caught on. Ink doesn't roll under the table. Still, there's something charming about the tokens. You imagine yourself going to the market with a little pouch of them tied at your belt. You hand the baker 3 loaf tokens and he nods, passing you bread. No arguments, no forgotten promises. It's almost elegant, if a little clunky. The fire pops, sending shadows dancing over the tokens. For a moment, they look alive, tiny clay flocks and herds spread across the table, waiting to be counted. You realize you're watching the moment numbers become objects and objects become symbols. This is the leap toward lists. Humanity, once content with memory and barter, is now inventing shortcuts. That a cat wanders into the chamber, tail high, and bats at a sheep token, sending it skittering across the floor. The students groan, chasing after it. You grin. Even the best system has its flaws. Lists may tame chaos, but cats still reign supreme. You step back, letting the clatter of clay fade behind you. Outside, the night is hushed, the Nile whispering. In the distance, you feel a kind of reverence, not for temples or pharaohs, but for tiny clay tokens. They're so small, so unassuming, yet they carry the weight of an empire's memory. Without them, without what they evolved into, even pharaohs, mighty pyramids would remain half-built piles of stone. You shuffle down a stone-paved lane, still carrying the taste of gritty bread and sludgy beer on your tongue. Ahead, torchlight gleams against massive walls. You've stumbled upon a temple complex, but instead of hushed prayers, you hear the grunts of oxen and the scrape of baskets dragged across stone floors. Inside, the temple is less a sanctuary and more a warehouse, a giant vault for Egypt's surplus. Here, Grain towers higher than you can see. Jars of oil are stacked like soldiers, and bleating goats echo through the corridors. The temple is not only spiritual, it's logistical. Priests and scribes huddle in corners, scratching on papyrus sheets, counting everything. This place is the beating heart of Egypt's economic engine. Grain isn't just food, it's wealth, tax, survival. A temple without lists would collapse under its own abundance. You pause at the entrance, overwhelmed by the smell, dust, grain, dung, incense all swirling together into a heady cocktail. Here's your anchor fact. Temples in ancient Egypt were the centers of redistribution. Farmers delivered a portion of their harvests here as tax, and the temple priests and scribes organized the storage and rationing of goods. These records, grain tallies, livestock inventories, oil distributions, are among the earliest surviving documents. You might picture a temple as solemn, but in reality it was part cathedral, part bank, part Costco, and now the quirky tidbit. Sometimes the grain stored inside temples doubled as emergency savings accounts. People could deposit grain and withdraw it later, with scribes tracking every transaction. Congratulations, you're looking at the ancestor of banking. Imagine walking into a temple with a jar of barley and saying, "Hold this for me," and "Don't let my brother-in-law touch it." The scribe dutifully writes it down, and suddenly you've got a secure deposit box, minus the air conditioning. Historians still argue whether temples were truly benevolent managers of these goods or whether they exploited farmers by hoarding wealth for the priestly elite. Some evidence suggests redistribution was fair, feeding the poor during lean years. Other evidence paints a less flattering picture. Temples as hoarders, feeding themselves richly while doling out scraps. The truth, like the smell in this storeroom, probably lay somewhere in between. You wander further into the temple hall. The stone walls tower above, painted with gods and offerings. At your feet, rats skitter across scattered grain, quick little shadows. A scribe yelps, swings his reed pen, and then sighs, scribbling another line to record losses. Yes, even rats make it into the accounting. Every temple inventory had to acknowledge waste, theft, or spoilage. Lists weren't just for glory, they were for all the gritty details of reality. You watch a priest dip his pen into red ink, used for special emphasis. He writes down shortfall beside a row of numbers. His brow furrows, but the record is clear. This isn't just spirituality, it's paperwork, the same old paperwork that will plague humanity forever. The priest mutters a prayer as he writes, but you're not sure if it's to the gods or to his own sense of exasperation that a donkey brays from the far end of the hall. Workers struggle to unload yet another cart of barley sacks. The scribes scurry forward, scratching furiously, trying to keep pace. You lean against a pillar and marvel at the sight. Order wrung from chaos, abundance turned into numbers, prayers turned into ledgers. Without these temple lists, the kingdom would starve or riot. With them, Pharaoh's realm ticks along like clockwork, and there's a moment of humor, too. A young novice scribe struggles with his pen, splattering ink across a sheet. He curses, softly, and the older scribe beside him scolds. That was 10 jars of oil, not 10 goats. The novice blushes, scratching furiously to fix his blunder. You smirk. Even in this solemn temple, mistakes happen, and someone probably went home confused about whether they'd ordered cooking oil or a small herd. You trail deeper still, past storerooms echoing with your footsteps. You see a sealed chamber, guarded by statues of jackals. Inside, jars of honey, incense, and precious oils gleam under torchlight. These aren't everyday goods. These are luxury items, reserved for offerings to gods or Pharaoh. Yet even here, scribes write careful lists, one jar at a time. Nothing escapes the ink. The temple grows quiet as the torches dim. A final scribe leans back, stretching his cramped hand. He sets down his pen, blows gently on the papyrus, and ties it into a scroll. Outside, the stars stretch endlessly, while in here, everything is compressed into neat symbols. You breathe slowly, realizing that temples weren't just places of worship. They were filing cabinets for an entire civilization. You step back out into the night, leaving the musty smell of grain behind. The air feels cooler, lighter, though a faint itch of dust clings to your throat. The Nile hums nearby, steady and eternal. You know now that lists were never trivial. They were sacred tools, as holy as hymns, as vital as bread. The clink of clay tokens fades, and you wander back toward the glow of torches on the horizon. This time, the road leads you straight to a colossal construction site. The air vibrates with the pounding of hammers, the groan of wooden sledges, dragged over sand, and the low chants of thousands of workers heaving stone. You've stumbled upon one of Egypt's grandest projects, a pyramid rising into the desert sky. And here, more than anywhere else, lists keep everything from crumbling. You take in the scene, a line of laborers, sweat glistening under the sun, carrying baskets of grain and jars of water. Overseers bark instructions, scribes hover nearby, with reed pens poised, and delivery carts creak under their loads. The scale is overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people need to be fed every day, housed, and kept working. Without precise records, the pyramid would collapse, not from stone, but from hunger. Here's the anchor fact. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Giza include papyrus records detailing ration distributions to workers, bread, beer, onions, and fish listed meticulously. These lists weren't afterthoughts. They were blueprints for survival. A single missing shipment could cause unrest, even rebellion. Pharaoh's stone dreams rested on papyrus checklists. Now the quirky tidbit, onions, appear everywhere in these records, sometimes even more frequently than bread. Egyptians believed onions had magical and medicinal properties. They warded off disease, boosted strength, maybe even protected against curses. Imagine a pyramid builder muttering, "I'll haul this block if I get my onion ration." It sounds absurd, but for them, onions were basically energy bars wrapped in papery skin. Historians still argue whether pyramid workers were slaves, conscripts, or paid laborers. The lists complicate the story. Rations suggest organized payment, not chains. Some scholars claim workers were honored citizens rotating through shifts as service to the state. Others insist harsh conscription dragged peasants here unwillingly. The truth remains in debate, scratched faintly into papyrus margins. You watch a scribe nearby, his reed pen moving quickly. He notes, 2 loaves, 1 onion, 1 jar of beer. He repeats it again and again as lines of workers pass. Each man receives his ration, checked against the list, then trudges toward the pyramid. You can almost hear the rhythm, bread, onion, beer, like a drumbeat powering the work. The smell is pungent, sweat, dust, crushed onion skins. A breeze kicks grit into your eyes, but you keep watching. The scribe sighs, dipping his pen again, his shoulders aching. He scratches another line, only to blot it out when he realizes he miscounted. For a moment, he mutters something that sounds suspiciously like sarcasm directed at the gods. Bureaucracy, after all, is eternal. Nearby, a laborer jokes, holding up his onion like a sacred relic. His friends laugh, clinking beer jars together in a mock toast. The pyramid rises slowly in the background, stone by stone, onion by onion. And you realize that this miracle of architecture isn't built only from limestone. It's built from lists, small, boring, vital lists. The overseer shouts, pointing at a delivery gone astray. A boy scurries over, thrusting a slip of papyrus into the man's hand. The overseer scans the symbols, nods, and redirects the load. Crisis averted. Without the list, the workers would have missed their meal. With it, they continue, sweat pouring, muscles straining, voices chanting in time. And here's a sly bit of humor. One cart tips, spilling jars of beer into the sand. The scribe sighs deeply, scribbles spillage onto his list, and moves on. You chuckle at the thought. Some poor worker probably cried. That was my bonus. Spillage or not, it's still accounted for. Pharaoh's pyramid won't tolerate fuzzy math. You tilt your head back and gaze at the unfinished structure. It looms against the horizon, impossibly massive. Yet you know the secret now. It isn't divine power or brute force alone. It's paperwork. Thousands of stones stacked neatly, because thousands of onions were stacked neatly first on papyrus sheets. Civilization balanced delicately on lists. The chanting continues, low and steady, mixing with the scratch of pens. You feel sleep tugging at you again, lulled by the rhythm of bread, onion, beer. Not the most glamorous lullaby, but effective. And as the pyramid grows taller in the distance, you smile at the absurd thought. Without grocery lists, maybe the wonders of the world would still be sitting half-finished in the desert sand. The sun dips lower, painting the pyramid site in a molten orange glow. Workers shuffle back toward their huts, bellies heavy with bread and beer, while scribes linger behind, rolling up their papyrus sheets and stretching sore fingers. You trail one of them down a narrow alley, curious about the tool of his trade. By the time you catch him in a quieter courtyard, he has unrolled a smaller sheet and begun to write in a style you haven't seen before. Quick strokes, sharp angles, less picture-like. This isn't the careful artistry of hieroglyphs. This is something else entirely. You lean closer and watch. His hand darts across the page, reed pen scratching furiously. It looks rushed, even messy, but it's fast. Faster than any neat hieroglyph. The scribe is writing in hieratic script, Egypt's shorthand, the cursive version of its sacred symbols. The difference is striking. Hieroglyphs are majestic paintings of owls, snakes, and suns, but hieratic is stripped down, boiled to essentials, built for speed. Here's the anchor fact. Hieratic script emerged around 2600 BCE and became the standard for everyday writing, administration, letters, inventories, shopping lists. Hieroglyphs were reserved for monuments and ritual inscriptions, the flashy stuff. Hieratic was the practical workhorse, letting scribes keep up with the demands of a kingdom that needed receipts faster than pretty pictures could provide. And the quirky tidbit, hieratic could get so sloppy that sometimes even other scribes couldn't read it. Entire fragments exist where historians still scratch their heads, unsure if they're looking at 10 loaves of bread or 10 donkeys. And bread. Imagine handing your roommate a grocery note and having them come back with livestock. You grin. The frustrations of bad handwriting are timeless. Historians still argue whether scribes intentionally made hieratic cryptic to guard their power, or if it was simply the natural speed of a stressed-out pen. Was it an elite's secret code, or just chicken scratch under pressure? The debate lingers, like trying to decide whether doctors today write messy prescriptions to look mysterious, or because they're just exhausted. The courtyard grows quiet except for the steady scratch of pen. You notice how hypnotic it is. Dip, stroke, flick. The scribe pauses, shakes ink from his fingers, then continues, his reed pen carving memory into papyrus. You tilt your head and imagine the sound as a lullaby of bureaucracy, soothing in its rhythm. Nearby, another scribe leans against a wall, laughing quietly at his colleague's messy scroll. He points at a symbol and teases, "That looks like a goose drowning in beer." The first scribe smirks, but doesn't bother correcting it. Who will care tomorrow, as long as the tally adds up? You chuckle. Ancient office banter isn't far from the present. The night air cools, carrying with it the smell of ink mixed with dust. You imagine hundreds of these scrolls stacked inside storerooms, a forest of hieratic lines quietly holding the kingdom together. Pharaoh's monuments may shout, but hieratic whispers are what keep the bread and beer flowing. A donkey brays in the distance, breaking the quiet. The scribe sighs, finishes his list, and blows gently on the ink. He ties the sheet with cord and places it in a basket beside dozens of others. For him, it's just another day. For you, it's a revelation. Humanity's survival hinged not on grand words carved in stone, but on quick scribbles jotted before the ink dried out. You follow him as he rises, his reed pen tucked back behind his ear. The moonlight washes over his face, and for a moment, he looks more tired clerk than divine servant. Yet in his hands, every onion, every loaf, every jar is preserved against forgetfulness. His messy hieratic lines might not be beautiful, but they are practical. And sometimes, practical is what keeps the world spinning. You linger there, eyelids heavy, soothed by the thought. Civilization, you realize, doesn't always look grand. Sometimes it looks like hasty handwriting, half-legible notes, and a scribe yawning as he trudges home. The courtyard fades, and you drift down a quieter street lined with mud brick houses. The torches here are softer, the voices gentler. You catch the faint scent of something exotic in the air, sweet, musky, floral. It draws you closer, past a doorway draped with woven reeds, into a small shop glowing with oil lamps. Inside, Shelves are lined with jars of perfumed oils, ointments, and incense cones stacked neatly like little pyramids. This is no ordinary stall of onions and barley. This is the boutique corner of the ancient marketplace. And yes, even here, lists matter. The shopkeeper greets you with a knowing smile, his fingers stained with resin and myrrh. He points proudly at a papyrus resting on the counter. Unlike the messy hieratic scribbles you saw earlier, this list is tidy, almost elegant. It notes each delivery of oils, frankincense, myrrh, lotus, cedarwood. These are luxuries, not staples, but they are tracked with the same devotion as bread and beer. The wealthy households of Egypt don't trust memory alone when it comes to something as precious as perfume. Here's your anchor fact. Perfumed oils were highly prized in Egypt, not just for scent, but for religious and medicinal use. They appear frequently in household accounts and temple offerings. Some papyri detail orders of oils sent to noble women or prepared for festivals, showing that luxury items had their own lists as carefully maintained as tax rolls. Now the quirky tidbit. Some perfumes doubled as mosquito repellent. Imagine a noblewoman dabbing a rare lotus oil on her wrists to smell divine, and then realizing it also keeps the bugs away. It's ancient multitasking, part beauty, part survival. You grin at the thought of someone saying, "Does myrrh bring out my eyes, or just stop the itching?" Historians still argue whether perfumes were mainly for the elite or whether middle class Egyptians had access to. Some say only nobles could afford them. Others point to household accounts suggesting smaller jars reached wider families. The truth likely lay in a spectrum. Extravagant blends for Pharaoh's court, simpler oils for everyday households. You lean closer to the jars. The air grows heavy with fragrance. Earthy myrrh, sharp cedar, sweet lotus. It swirls around you. Intoxicating but soothing. You imagine walking home with a tiny jar carefully tucked in your basket. A luxury recorded in neat hieratic symbols. 1 jar oil, 2 loaves bread. The mundane and the exquisite share the same line on the same list. A young woman enters, her veil drawn lightly over her hair. She hands the shopkeeper a scrap of papyrus. He nods, scans the list, and fetches her order: cedar oil, incense cones, and a small pot of honey ointment. She tucks it all into her bag without a word. You smile. She's following a shopping list. 2, just as carefully as anyone else. Perfume, not onions, but the principle is the same. Don't forget what you came for. The shopkeeper chuckles as he jots another line. He dips his reed pen, noting the sale, muttering about customers who come back twice because they forgot an item. His grumble feels timeless. You've done the same with toothpaste or milk. Even in Egypt, forgetfulness is universal. The shop grows warmer, the perfumes thicker in the air, making your eyelids heavy. The scribe shopkeeper scratches on, his pen squeaking softly as he balances accounts. He looks weary but satisfied. Each mark is another step toward order in a fragrant, fleeting world. Without the list, someone would forget the oil and end up with only onions. With it, even rare luxuries flow smoothly through the market. Outside, the night hums with crickets, the Nile a whisper in the background. You breathe deeply, filling your lungs with sweet resin. It clings to you, comforting, as though sleep itself were perfumed. You step back onto the street, realizing that even the smallest indulgence of ancient Egypt survives because someone wrote it down. The sweet perfume lingers in your nose as you wander further into the narrow alleys. Here, the streets feel more domestic, quiet chatter from courtyards, the soft splash of water as someone rinses clay jars, and the faint laughter of children chasing each other in the dust. You glance through an open doorway and see a woman seated on a reed mat, a small lamp burning beside her. She isn't weaving or grinding grain. Instead, she's holding a small shard of pottery, an ostrakhan, scratched faintly with ink. She runs her finger down the marks as though reading a reminder to herself. For the first time, you see that shopping lists weren't only in the hands of officials and priests. They lived in kitchens and courtyards, too. The ostrakhan is humble. Just a broken bit of pottery, reused instead of tossed away. On it, a few lines are written in quick hieratic script: bread, fish, oil. Simple, direct, practical. The woman pauses, frowning, and mutters something about needing more honey. She picks up a reed pen, dips it in ink, and adds another line. There it is, the timeless gesture of anyone managing a household, the add-on item, even thousands of years ago. Oh, I almost forgot, was part of life. That here's your anchor fact. Archaeological evidence shows that women in ancient Egypt often managed household accounts. Letters and notes on ostraca reveal wives keeping track of supplies, writing reminders, and even sending instructions to servants. Literacy was limited, but it wasn't exclusively male. Women of certain households, especially in towns like Deir el-Medina, clearly used lists for domestic management. Now for the quirky tidbit. Sometimes women's lists included cosmetics alongside bread and beer. Tiny jars of malachite, paint, or coal show up in household records. Imagine a note that reads, 2 loaves of bread, 1 jar of beer, eyeliner. It feels oddly modern, like someone jotting eggs, milk, mascara. You smirk, civilization may change, but priorities remain. Historians still argue whether literacy among women was common or exceptional. Some argue most wives dictated lists to literate servants or family members. Others believe more women could write than traditionally assumed, pointing to increasing evidence from ostraca and graffiti. The truth is hazy, and you picture debates in modern lecture halls as scholars argue heatedly about whether that neat line of hieratic belonged to a man or a woman. Back in the courtyard, the woman rolls her shoulders and calls to her daughter. The girl toddles over, carrying a basket, half her size. The mother reads the shard aloud and hands it to her. Bread, fish, honey. The daughter nods solemnly, as though preparing for a heroic quest, and scampers toward the market. You smile at the scene. The world's earliest errand run, the smell of cooking wafts from the neighbor's house, lentil stew simmering, seasoned with garlic and herbs. Another woman appears at her doorway, waving her own ostrakon, comparing notes with her friend. They laugh when they realize they both forgot onions. You feel the warmth of the moment. Shopping lists here aren't just tools, they're threads, weaving households together. The lamplight flickers as the woman adds one last note. Her pen scratches gently, the sound almost like a lullaby. She sets the shard beside her bread jar and leans back, sighing with the same tired satisfaction you know today after finishing chores. A list may be short, may be humble, but it gives a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic. Outside, the stars brighten, and you walk on, leaving the courtyards behind. You carry the image of women managing households with quick notes, scrawled reminders, and last-minute add-ons. Civilization isn't built only by pharaohs and scribes. It's kept alive by mothers remembering to buy onions. You leave the quiet courtyards behind, following the faint creak of wheels along a sandy road. The sound grows louder until a caravan appears, its oxen snorting under the weight of cargo-laden carts. The air shifts, rich with strange scents, spices you can't place, resins that sting your nose, even the metallic tang of copper. The caravan has come from far away, and every bundle, every jar, every stone must be written down. Lists, once used for bread and beer, now stretch across deserts and seas. You step closer to the carts. A man unwraps a bundle to reveal blue stones gleaming in the lamplight. Lapis lazuli, brought from Afghanistan. Another cart carries frankincense and myrrh from Punt, their resinous aroma thick and sticky sweet. A scribe sits cross-legged nearby, unrolling a papyrus scroll as long as his arm. He dips his reed pen and begins cataloging. 1 jar of incense, 2 bundles of lapis, 3 baskets of ivory. His voice mutters each item aloud, anchoring the words as though afraid the foreign treasures will vanish if not captured in ink. Here's your anchor fact. Trade in ancient Egypt extended far beyond the Nile. Expeditions to Punt, Sinai, and the Levant brought incense, precious stones, cedar wood, and exotic animals. Surviving records detail shipments of these goods, carefully listed to track their arrival and use. Egypt's wealth wasn't just in its grain, it was in how well it kept track of everything entering its borders. And the quirky tidbit, sometimes the lists included live animals, baboons, monkeys, even giraffes. Imagine trying to keep that organized. 1 loaf of bread, 1 jar of oil. Oh, and don't forget the giraffe. You chuckle, picturing a scribe nervously doodling a stick-figure giraffe in the margin just so he wouldn't forget. Historians still argue whether these expeditions were regular trade missions or rare, state-sponsored adventures. Some scholars see evidence of organized commerce. Others argue they were sporadic voyages designed to dazzle Pharaoh's court with exotic wonders. Either way, the lists remain, whispering of ships creaking back up the Nile with goods carefully counted. You walk alongside the caravan as it halts near a storehouse. Workers unload bundles, and the scribe checks them off one by one. The smell of incense grows thicker, mingling with the sweat of oxen and the sharp tang of cedar. You glance at his scroll, and though you can't read the hieratic lines, you sense their importance. These words transform fragile treasures into secure possessions. Without them, lapis is just a pile of rocks, incense just sticky lumps. With them, they become wealth, accounted for and protected. That a boy runs past carrying a jar of frankincense, tripping on a stone. The jar shatters, smoke curling upward in a cloud of perfume. The scribe sighs heavily, scratches a line on the scroll, lost in transit, and waves the boy away. You grin. Even in Egypt, shipping mistakes happened, and someone somewhere probably grumbled. That was supposed to be insured. The caravan leader kneels beside the scribe, pointing at the list. They murmur together, cross-checking each bundle. Behind them, guards keep watch, spears gleaming under torchlight. These goods aren't just luxuries, they're politics, gifts. For Pharaoh, bribes for officials, symbols of Egypt's dominance. The lists don't just count, they control. You watch the final cart unload a cage containing a restless baboon. The animal screeches, startling the workers. The scribe grimaces, writes a hurried line, and mutters under his breath. You imagine he's writing, "One angry baboon, handle with care." You can't help but laugh softly, though the workers don't. For them, it's just another item. Another tally. As the caravan disperses, the scroll is rolled up carefully and tied with cord. The scribe tucks it under his arm as though it were more valuable than the lapis itself. And in a way, it is. Without that scroll, the goods are chaos. With it, they are order, wealth, tribute, empire. The night deepens as you turn away, the air still tinged with incense. You breathe slowly, heavy-eyed, realizing that lists weren't just for loaves and onions anymore. They stretched across deserts, seas, and mountains, binding the farthest corners of the known world into neat hieratic lines. The sweet smoke of incense still lingers in your clothes as you drift toward another crowd of workers. This time, you're not at a pyramid site or a luxury stall, but near a line of men gathered in the fading light, each clutching a clay jug. The air hums with chatter, laughter, and the earthy smell of fermentation. You've wandered into the world of beer rations, the daily bread of Egyptian life, and the scribes are here, too, pins scratching furiously to make sure every sip is counted. You lean against a post and watch as each worker steps forward. A scribe unfurls a narrow papyrus, his pen moving with rhythmic certainty. One jar, 2 jars. It's monotonous but vital. Beer isn't just a treat. It's payment, nutrition, and morale wrapped into one cloudy jug. Without these lists, workers would riot faster than you can say cheers. Here's your anchor fact. Records from sites like Deir el Medina show endless tallies of beer distributed to laborers, artisans, and soldiers. Beer was the backbone of Egyptian wages, standardized rations measured in jugs, noted carefully in ink. Archaeologists have uncovered entire papyri devoted to beer accounts, revealing just how central this foamy staple was. And now the quirky tidbit. Egyptian beer wasn't filtered. It often contained chunks of bread floating in it. Imagine sipping your wages and chewing mid-gulp. Workers didn't mind. They called it food and drink in one. You smile at the thought. Liquid lunch was already trending thousands of years before offices existed. Historians still argue whether workers truly enjoyed this beer or tolerated it as necessity. Some suggest they relished it, praising its filling quality. Others argue it was the cheapest option available, consumed because water sources were often unsafe. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Beer was comfort and compromise, eagerly awaited at the end of a blistering day. You hear the workers joke as they clutch their rations. One man holds up his jug and declares, "Mine looks bigger than yours." His neighbor laughs, retorting, "That's because you're short." The scribe sighs, writes another line, and tries to ignore them. Even in ancient times, the line at the bar was full of banter. The scene grows funnier. A jug tips, spilling thick beer across the sand. A worker dives forward, scooping with his hands, while the scribe groans and scratches spillage onto the list. You chuckle softly. Imagine the world's earliest insurance claim. Lost one jug of beer. Reasons: clumsiness. The air fills with the sour-sweet smell of fermentation. Nearby, large vats bubble as brewers stir with long wooden paddles. Steam curls upward, glowing in the torchlight. You picture the scribes wandering between vats, jotting down ingredients: barley, water, herbs, time of brewing. Even recipes were lists, preserved to keep the beer consistent. One brewer, clearly exhausted, nods off against a vat. His reed pen slips, drawing a jagged line across his papyrus. He startles awake, cursing softly, then smears the ink with his thumb in frustration. You grin, recognizing the eternal curse of paperwork, sleepy errors that no one notices until it's too late. The workers move away with their rations, voices rising in cheerful songs. The scribe packs up his scroll, tucks his pen behind his ear, and looks around wearily. He's written dozens of lines today, yet the ink feels endless. Beer will be brewed again tomorrow, distributed again, recorded again. Lists are relentless. Companions, unglamorous but unshakable. You breathe deeply, and the smell of yeast and barley swirls into something strangely soothing. The chants of workers fade into the background like a lullaby. It dawns on you that these tallies of beer, so monotonous and repetitive, are the quiet heartbeat of Egyptian life. Without them, chaos. With them, another day carried smoothly into night. The laughter of beer-soaked workers drifts behind you as you wander down a darker, quieter lane. Here, the houses are low, their windows shuttered, the torches dim. You catch the faint scratch of a reed pen and follow the sound until you see two men huddled by lamplight, squinting at a scrap of papyrus. One gestures angrily, the other shrugs. You step closer and realize they aren't arguing about onions or beer. They're arguing about whether ordinary people could even read what's written. It hits you. Literacy itself is in question. For all the scribes and neat lists you've seen, how many Egyptians could actually understand them? Were shopping notes and ration scrolls truly for everyone? Or were they locked behind the gate of scribal power? Here's the anchor fact: literacy in ancient Egypt was limited. Estimates vary, but many scholars suggest only 1 to 5% of the population could read and write, mostly scribes, priests, and officials. Yet lists and notes circulated everywhere, in temples, work sites, households. This creates a paradox: who wrote them, who read them, and who simply trusted them as symbols of authority? Now the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found practice. Ostraca, shards covered in the messy handwriting of students. Some look like the ancient equivalent of doodles and spelling tests. Repeated hieroglyphs, half-finished phrases, even jokes. One ostracon shows a badly drawn duck alongside the word for duck, as though a scribe in training got bored. Imagine your homework ending up in a museum. Historians still argue whether most Egyptians recognized at least some symbols, like the sign for bread or beer, even if they couldn't read full texts. Some believe these symbols functioned almost like logos, instantly recognizable to non-literate people. Others insist that literacy was sharply divided, that common Egyptians relied on scribes entirely. The debate remains heated, like scholars bickering over whether emojis count as reading. You lean against the doorway, watching the two men. One, clearly illiterate, jabs at the papyrus and says, "It says I should get more grain." The other shakes his head, pointing to the lines. "No, it says 1 loaf less." They glare at each other until a scribe wanders by, sighs, and reads the line aloud. The illiterate man frowns, muttering about unfairness, while the scribe shrugs. It's all there in ink. You can feel the imbalance in the air. A list, after all, is only as fair as the person who writes or reads it. For some, it's liberation from forgetfulness. For others, it's a prison of trust. They can only believe what the ink says, never knowing if it lies. The lamplight flickers, casting shadows across the papyrus. You see the allure of literacy, the way it turns fleeting words into permanence, but also the unease. Maybe that's why so many Egyptians carved images into tomb walls, to make sure even those who couldn't read could still understand. Bread painted is still bread promised that a boy nearby practices on a shard, his pen strokes. Clumsy. He mutters the sounds of each sign, repeating them like a chant. His mother watches proudly, though she can't read a word herself. You feel the weight of it. Literacy isn't just about lists. It's about who holds power, who gets to decide whether promises are kept. Yet, there's humor too. Another boy steals the shard, adds a doodle of a donkey, and writes the word scribe beside it. The practicing boy groans, chasing him, while the adults laugh. Even here, in the tension of literacy, someone finds room for a joke. The night air presses cooler now, and you step away, your thoughts heavier. Lists may be everywhere in Egypt, but not everyone can read them. That's their strength and their danger. As you walk, you realize something unsettling. A list can be a memory aid, or it can be a leash. For most Egyptians, it was probably both. The laughter of children fades as you walk deeper into the desert night. The air grows cooler, drier, and the moon hangs like a pale coin above the sand. Your footsteps crunch softly until you find yourself inside a hushed stone chamber, its walls flickering with torchlight. This isn't a marketplace or storeroom. It's a tomb. And as your eyes adjust, you realize the walls themselves are lists. Not for the living, but for the dead. Everywhere you look, carvings depict bread loaves, jars of beer, cuts of meat, baskets of onions, bolts of linen. They march in neat rows, painted in bright colors, each offering carefully labeled. These aren't decorations. They're eternal shopping lists, carved to ensure the deceased would never go hungry in the afterlife. If you can't take it with you, the Egyptians thought, at least write it down and carve it in stone so the gods will deliver it. Here's the anchor fact. Offering lists are a defining feature of Egyptian tombs. These inventories, often carved on walls or stelae, detail the food, drink, clothing, and ritual items required to sustain the dead forever. Priests read the lists during rituals, activating them so the deceased soul could receive the goods. Without them, the afterlife risked becoming very empty. Now the quirky tidbit. Some lists included oddly specific items, like 1 goose with trimmings or 365 jars of beer. One tomb inscription even asked for infinite bread. You smile at the thought. Someone essentially hacked immortality by writing unlimited refills on their eternal grocery order. If only modern restaurants honored that trick. Historians still argue whether these offering lists were symbolic or if priests actually tried to supply the goods regularly. Some believe temples and families replenished tombs faithfully. Others suggest most offerings were symbolic, with the carved lists serving as metaphysical IOUs. The truth probably mixed devotion with practicality. A little ritual bread here, a carved infinite bread there. You run your hand along the carved loaves, their outlines still crisp despite millennia. The paint glows faintly in the torchlight, reds for meat, yellows for bread, blues for precious stone vessels. It feels less like art and more like a ledger, carved so boldly that even death couldn't erase it. You whisper to yourself, 1 loaf, 1 jar, 1 eternity. A priest steps into the chamber, chanting softly. He carries a real loaf of bread and places it before the wall, aligning it perfectly with the painted offering. He mutters the ritual words, then bows. For him, the carved list is alive, binding this world to the next. You watch, half awed, half smiling, thinking, even in death, Egyptians feared forgetting their shopping that there's humor here, too. On one wall, a line of fish offerings looks suspiciously exaggerated, rows upon rows, far more than one family could ever eat. You imagine the deceased, demanding, better write down more, just in case. You can almost hear his ghost saying, don't forget the onions, too. The chamber grows still again, the torch crackling softly. You feel the strangeness of it, a civilization that turned grocery notes into prayers. Lists became spells, reminders became eternity. It's oddly comforting, the idea that something as mundane as a shopping list could outlive flesh and bone. You step outside into the moonlight, the desert air cool against your skin. Behind you, the tomb glows faintly, its carved lists waiting. patiently for another 1,000 years. And you realize something. For the Egyptians, lists weren't just about survival in the present. They were about survival forever. The desert tomb fades into silence behind you, and your feet carry you back toward the hum of ordinary life. A faint glow catches your eye. Another scribe at work, bent over his papyrus by lamplight. You wander closer, expecting the same steady rhythm of neat lists. But this time, you notice something different. The scribe looks flustered, his lips muttering, his pen darting quickly, then pausing, then scribbling corrections. You peek over his shoulder, and what you see makes you grin. A mistake dot on the papyrus before him is a ration list. Bread, beer, onions, everything seems fine until you spot a line that reads something like 500 chickens. You glance at the baskets nearby. There are maybe 5. Somewhere between brain and pen, the poor man added 2 extra zeros. He groans, scratches furiously, and dips his reed pen again. His ink smears, his corrections sloppy. Civilization may rest on lists, but humanity still trips over typos. Here's the anchor fact. Papyri and ostraca often preserve corrections, erasures, or overwritten lines. Scribes weren't perfect. Their training was rigorous, but mistakes were inevitable. Some documents show lines scratched out or numbers altered, proving that even in the ancient world, paperwork was messy. And now the quirky tidbit. One ostracon found at Deir el-Medina shows a tally where a scribe accidentally mixed units, listing goats where jars of beer should have been. It created a hilariously impossible record. 12 goats of beer. You chuckle, imagining the confusion. Excuse me, do you want me to pour your pint from a goat? Historians still argue whether these mistakes were tolerated lightly or punished harshly. Some evidence suggests scribes were expected to be nearly flawless, their training punishingly strict. Others think minor errors were shrugged off, as long as totals balanced eventually. The truth may depend on context. Pharaoh's tax list? Don't mess up. A worker's onion ration? Maybe a little wiggle room. The scribe before you sighs, rubbing his temple. His apprentice leans in, squints at the numbers, and snickers quietly. The older man shoots him a glare sharp enough to silence him. You can almost hear the inner muttering. One day, kid, you'll botch a chicken count too. You stay a little longer, watching the chaos unfold. The scribe dips his pen again, carefully rewrites 5 chickens, then adds a margin note for clarity. His papyrus looks less like neat order and more like a battlefield of ink blotches. You smile. It's a reminder that even in a civilization obsessed with order, humanity's messiness slipped through. Outside, the breeze carries the smell of roasting fowl. Someone in the neighborhood laughs loudly, perhaps already cooking the very chickens this scribe has miscounted. You can't help but think. Maybe the workers knew and teased the scribes behind their backs. Maybe some joked, ask for 500 chickens. Maybe they'll slip. The thought makes you chuckle. You imagine modern parallels, emails with typos, grocery lists where autocorrect changes milk to silk, spreadsheets where 1 extra zero bankrupts a project. Ancient Egypt wasn't immune. Their version of Excel errors was ink smeared across papyrus and chickens turning into armies. The lamplight flickers lower. The scribe finally rolls up his papyrus, muttering a prayer to Thoth, god of writing, to forgive the slip. His apprentice chuckles again once his back is turned. You breathe out slowly, soothed by the thought. Even the mighty machinery of Pharaoh's empire ran on fragile human hands, shaky pen strokes, and the occasional ridiculous mistake. The night air welcomes you as you step away, the scene still fresh in your mind. 1,000 years from now, someone will find that papyrus and laugh at the 500 chickens just as you did. Mistakes, too, are immortal. The memory of the 500 chickens makes you chuckle as you drift back toward the noise of the marketplace. Morning is breaking again, and the stalls are already buzzing. You hear voices rise and fall, laughter, mixing with haggling, the rhythmic slap of bread dough on clay ovens. This time, though, you focus less on the goods themselves and more on the chatter, the gossip, the murmurs, the little notes of social life that hover above every transaction. Lists may hold the numbers, but the air around them is filled with stories. You pause by a group of women standing with baskets on their hips, comparing their shopping notes. One reads from an ostracon shard. 2 loaves, Fish, honey. Another nods and mutters. And don't forget onions. They laugh, rolling their eyes as though onions haunt every errand. A child tugs at his mother's dress, begging for sweets, and she shakes her head firmly, tapping her list. The discipline is timeless. No candy until the necessities are done. Here's your anchor fact. Archaeological finds at village sites like Deir el Medina preserve countless ostraca covered not only with formal accounts, but also with what look like shopping notes or delivery reminders. These fragments reveal the everyday lives of ordinary Egyptians, gossip, errands, casual records, all scratched out alongside official tallies. Lists weren't just about taxes or temples. They thrived in village chatter. Now the quirky tidbit. Some ostraca include doodles and caricatures, little sketches of neighbors or animals. One famous example shows a cat serving a mouse, a satirical reversal of the natural order. Imagine a gossiping neighbor scribbling a cartoon of a lazy farmer beside her grocery notes. Lists, it seems, were also canvases for boredom. Historians still argue whether these informal lists were written by literate villagers themselves or dictated to hired scribes. Did the average market-goer scratch their own notes, or did they pay someone nearby to do it for them? The debate continues, but as you watch these women muttering over their ostraca, you sense the truth may be that both happened. Whoever could write, wrote, and whoever couldn't, relied on the kindness or irritation of others. You drift closer to a stall selling fish. The vendor, scales glittering on his hands, glances at his customer's papyrus slip before nodding. He pulls 3 fish from a basket, drops them into a sack, and scratches his own mark onto a pottery shard. It's not just memory, it's a tiny echo of a receipt. He grins toothlessly, saying something that makes his customer laugh. The list has settled the deal without a quarrel. The marketplace hums louder. Everywhere, people reference scraps of papyrus, pointed ostraca, mutter about who owes what. But it's never just numbers. You hear one man gossip that his neighbor watered down his beer. Another swears his cousin still owes him onions from last week. A woman teases her friend about buying perfume instead of garlic. The lists anchor the trade, but the chatter makes it human. You pause to listen to 2 older men leaning against a wall. One squints at his shard and says, "I wrote bread, oil, and what's this symbol?" His friend peers closer and chuckles. "Looks like donkey dong. Maybe you were drunk." They both burst into laughter, their shoulders shaking, before agreeing to fetch beer anyway. The shard might be nonsense, but the ritual of consulting it keeps them grounded. The smells intensify: fish, garlic, incense, sweat. The heat rises as the sun climbs, and the marketplace becomes a swirl of voices. You feel the hypnotic rhythm of it. List, trade, gossip, laughter. The scribes may think of lists as order, but for villagers, they're woven into community life. As casual and noisy as gossip by the well. A boy runs past, waving a scrap of papyrus like a banner. He shouts his errands proudly. Bread, honey, beer. His friends chase him, laughing, until he drops the sheet into the dirt. They pounce on it, pretending to rewrite his list with imaginary items. Add crocodile dung, one teases. And 500 chickens, another shouts, and you grin at the callback. Even children turned lists into play. The sun warms your skin, and the voices blend into a soft drone, a lullaby of chatter and commerce. You realize lists weren't just practical, they were social glue. They gave people a reason to gather, to argue, to joke, to share. Civilization was never silent rows of numbers. It was voices buzzing over scraps of ink. The market's laughter lingers as you wander down a quieter lane, where the chatter shifts from gossip to speculation. You hear 2 scholars in linen robes, sitting under a shaded portico, arguing with the intensity of men who have too much time and too many papyri. They wave their reed pens like weapons, their voices rising and falling. You edge closer and realize they're debating the very thing you've been following all along. What were lists really for? One scholar insists that lists were simple memory aids. People are forgetful, he says, tapping his temple. They need notes for bread, beer, and taxes. That's all. His colleague snorts and slaps a scroll against his knee. Nonsense. Lists are about control. Pharaoh doesn't care if you remember onions. He cares if you owe onions. Every list is a leash. Here's the anchor fact. Historians have long studied Egyptian lists not only as practical documents, but as political tools. Inventories and tax records weren't just about keeping order. They reinforced Pharaoh's authority, proving his ability to command and redistribute resources across the land. Now the quirky tidbit. Some lists include hilariously trivial items, like a single goose or half a jug of beer. Imagine recording that with solemn ink, as though the fate of the empire hinged on poultry. You grin at the thought of an exhausted scribe writing, "Yes, yes, one goose fine," and filing it away. Next to monumental grain accounts, historians still argue whether the everyday notes found on ostraca, shopping reminders, small debts, were truly personal, or whether they were training exercises for scribes, never meant for actual households. Some believe many shopping lists are simply students practicing, their casual doodles mistaken for authentic errands. Others argue that the sheer volume of these scraps proves they were real. The debate continues, sharpened by each new shard pulled from the desert. You lean back against a pillar and listen. The scholars grow louder, their words bouncing off the stone walls. One insists lists democratize survival by preserving memory for the common man. The other insists lists centralized power, stripping memory from the individual and giving it to the state. You find yourself smiling. Thousands of years later, modern scholars argue the same way, their own lists of interpretations filling bookshelves. Nothing changes but the handwriting. Nearby, a young student tries to sneak away from his teachers, clutching a broken shard of pottery covered in messy script. He whispers to his friend, "It's just a list of beer rations." His friend laughs, "Or it's the key to Pharaoh's power." They run off, leaving you with the scholars. Voices droning like cicadas. The air grows heavy as the sun dips lower. You imagine two layers of Egypt side by side. The everyday villager muttering, "Don't forget onions," and the Pharaoh's officials muttering, "Don't forget to tax onions." The list is both personal and political, harmless and dangerous, memory and power. You chuckle as you picture a modern comparison, a shopping list on your fridge that reads milk, bread, eggs. Innocent enough. But if the government demanded to see it, track it, and tax it, suddenly that same list feels like surveillance. Egypt's scribes walked that tightrope daily, and sometimes even they must have wondered, am I preserving memory or enforcing Pharaoh's will? As the scholar's argument drifts into repetition, you step away. Their voices fade into the distance, blending with the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. You feel the paradox settling in your chest. Lists are both lifelines and chains. Perhaps the truth is that they're exactly what people need them to be. Comfort when you want to remember, control when someone else wants to remind you. You leave the scholars to their endless bickering and wander down a side street where the smell of smoke and ink hangs heavy. Ahead, you see scraps of papyrus piled in baskets, their edges frayed, their ink faded. A scribe squats by the heap, carefully trimming strips with a bronze knife. You realize with a small laugh, these are recycled lists. Even in a land that worshipped writing, papyrus was too precious to waste. He lifts one sheet toward the lamplight. On the front, you spot neat hieratic notes, an old tax account of grain owed to the temple. But the back? A much humbler scrawl. 2 loaves, 1 jar of oil. The past reused as the present. Pharaoh's demand turned into someone's grocery note. You smile at the absurdity of it, like jotting down a shopping list on the back of a legal contract. The Egyptians weren't sentimental about paperwork. They were practical. Here's the anchor fact. Papyrus was expensive, especially compared to pottery shards, ostraca. Many Egyptians reused older documents, writing over faded ink or scribbling on discarded scraps. This practice, called palimpsesting when texts were erased and overwritten, shows up across archives and dumps. A king's forgotten decree might end up as someone's reminder to buy fish. And the quirky tidbit, some scribes even wrote sideways across old text, unconcerned about the confusion. Imagine finding a papyrus where a grand hymn to Ammonius runs vertically, and a humble note about onions runs horizontally across it. Future archaeologists must have blinked twice, wondering whether Pharaoh secretly loved groceries. Historians still argue whether recycling was common among elites or limited to poorer scribes and households. Some claim officials always had fresh papyrus, Others point to evidence of reused scrolls even in temple libraries. The truth likely spans both worlds. Waste not, want not, especially in a desert economy. The scribe chuckles as he works. He mutters to himself, Pharaoh won't miss this margin, and scratches down a reminder for his wife. Another man approaches, handing him a faded papyrus roll. They bargain briefly. Then the scribe tears the roll in half and hands back a smaller piece, freshly blanked by scraping. It's ancient recycling at its finest. You kneel and pick up a discarded fragment. The faded ink reads like a ghost, rows of numbers long past meaning. Across it, a newer line glimmers dark, one goose. You chuckle softly. Even scraps of empire end up boiled down to poultry. The lamplight flickers, and you notice how soothing the process feels. The scribe dips his pen again, his stroke steady, his face relaxed. Around him, the basket of scraps shrinks as he transforms yesterday's decrees into today's shopping notes. Civilization, it seems, survives not just on lists but on the habit of rewriting them endlessly. That a boy runs past, snatches a scrap, and scribbles his own joke. 10 cats, 1 donkey, and a wife. The scribe groans, but the boy dashes off laughing. You grin. Even the most solemn medium can become a playground in the right hands. The air cools as the fire burns lower. The scribe gathers his reused slips, tucks them into a pouch, and heads home. His day's work wasn't monumental, but it kept onions and oil flowing, kept households from forgetting, and gave old papyrus a second life. You step away, imagining how many ancient lists were erased, rewritten, and lost, their ink bleeding into silence. And yet, here and there, a scrap survives to tell you. People were forgetful, thrifty, and practical, just like you. You exhale, slowly, soothed by the thought. Paper, parchment, sticky notes, phone reminders, it's all the same cycle. Egypt's scribes were simply the first to recycle their shopping notes. The smell of old ink and recycled papyrus drifts away as you follow the Nile's bend toward a busier quarter of the city. Here, instead of scraps and shards, you see neat scrolls stacked in reed baskets, their ends tied with colored cords. Scribes sit in rows, unrolling sheets longer than your arm. Their pens scratch rapidly, not with small reminders, but with tall, organized columns. You realize you've stepped into the future of lists, no longer quick notes for bread and beer, but full-fledged. Ledgers. One scribe unrolls his scroll across a low wooden desk. The lines run in careful rows: deliveries, dates, recipients, totals. His reed pen flicks efficiently, the ink dark and precise. You lean closer, marveling at how professional it looks. This isn't the casual grocery reminder you saw in a courtyard. It's an accounting system, a proto-spreadsheet. Lists have evolved into ledgers, and Egypt hums more smoothly because of it. Here's the anchor fact. By the Middle and New Kingdoms, Egyptian scribes compiled extensive administrative accounts on papyrus, ledgers of labor assignments, tax registers, inventories of temple goods. These weren't scraps. They were multi-page scrolls, organized into sections, complete with corrections and totals. From them, we glimpsed the machinery of Egypt's economy. Now the quirky tidbit. Some scrolls record hilariously specific details, like 1 jar of honey for the overseer's sandals. Yes, honey for sandals, likely to soften the leather. You smile at the image of an accountant dutifully noting, sandals moisturized, check. Even the tiniest oddities earned a line in the ledger. Historians still argue whether these ledgers were kept mainly for practical daily use or for long-term archival power. Some think they were live documents, updated constantly by scribes on site. Others believe they were recopied and stored as permanent proof of order, Pharaoh's ink-stamped dominion. The truth may be both. Notes scribbled in the dust today, scrolls tied neatly in archives tomorrow. The scene around you feels orderly, almost serene. Scribes mutter softly as they write, each line balancing the last. One tallies grain received from farmers, another calculates rations distributed to pyramid workers, another records temple donations. Their work overlaps like the gears of a clock, each ledger feeding into the next. Civilization ticks forward, not on stone wheels or bronze gears, but on papyrus columns. And yet, humor sneaks in. One scribe sighs, scratches out a line, and rewrites it. His colleague leans over and jokes. Another goose lost in the numbers? The scribe rolls his eyes but grins, muttering something about phantom chickens haunting the scroll. Even in bureaucratic ledgers, the ghost of errors persists. You let your eyes wander across the scrolls. They look strangely modern, rows, columns, totals. You can almost hear the faint hum of an abacus or the click of a calculator. This is where the humble shopping note has been heading all along, growing longer, broader, more structured. And though the ink is faintly smudged, the sense of permanence radiates. These ledgers aren't just for today's onions. They're for tomorrow's memory that a boy rushes in, carrying a delivery of new papyrus rolls. The scribes cheer softly, relieved, as though fresh office supplies just arrived. The boy beams with pride. He's feeding the machine of memory. One day, he too might become a scribe, adding his scratchings to the endless flow. The lamplight glows golden on the scrolls, the ink shining faintly. You realize you're no longer watching a marketplace memory trick, but a true bureaucracy. Lists have matured, grown legs, become ledgers. The empire itself breathes through them, every loaf and onion noted, every jug of beer preserved in ink. You step away slowly, hearing the gentle drone of pens behind you. It's almost hypnotic, like the ticking of a clock before sleep. And you think. From clay tokens to ostraca shards, from scraps to scrolls, the list has evolved into something vast. Without it, Pharaoh's realm would collapse into sand. With it, the kingdom stretches into eternity. The drone of scribes fades as you step out into the open air again. The night has cooled, the stars burn bright, and the Nile glimmers like a sheet of silver. You take a slow breath and realize you've reached the final stage of your journey. The scrolls, the ostraca, the papyrus fragments, they're all behind you now. What lingers instead is something softer, something familiar, the echo of lists in your own life. You glance at a modern image in your mind, a fridge door covered in sticky notes, a phone screen buzzing with reminders, a grocery app pinging milk, bread, eggs. It feels strange, and yet not so different from the papyrus scraps you've followed all night. Thousands of years separate you from Egypt, but the impulse is the same. Write it down before you forget. Lists tether the chaos of living into something manageable. Here's your anchor fact. Egypt's earliest shopping and ration lists are among the oldest written records of humanity. They show us not just grand monuments or kings' names, but the daily hum of survival: food, drink, clothing. The banal documents of scribes are now the most intimate windows into ancient life. And a quirky tidbit? Even in modern excavations, archaeologists have found doodles of donkeys, jokes, and notes scribbled alongside formal lists. It's as though across time, humans couldn't resist poking fun at their own paperwork. Civilization may change, but boredom with chores never does. Historians still argue whether to treat these lists as serious economic data or as casual, throwaway notes. Some see them as hard evidence of state control, others as glimpses of ordinary errands. You smile at the thought that maybe both are true. Lists are both mundane and monumental. They can build pyramids and also remind you to buy onions. You walk along the riverbank, the reeds whispering, the air heavy with the scent of silt and water. In your mind, fragments of Egyptian ink float beside your own mental reminders: bread, oil, beer, toothpaste, bananas. The through line is almost comic. You laugh softly under your breath, then yawn. The lists have done their work again, not just ordering survival, but gently lulling you toward rest. You stop, looking out over the Nile one last time. The river sighs, steady as ever, carrying memories forward. And you understand, the Egyptians didn't just invent lists for their own sake. They gave you a gift you're still using every day. The next time you scribble milk on a sticky note, you're echoing a habit that started under these very stars. The voices of scribes fade into the rustle of papyrus reeds. The laughter of workers fades into the buzz of crickets, and your eyes grow heavy. Civilization was never built only on stone. It was built on ink, on scratches of memory, on the soft, boring, wonderful discipline of shopping lists. Now the journey slows, the torches dim, and even the scribes have laid down their pens. The desert air is cooler, the sand no longer hot underfoot, but cool, soft, almost like water. You breathe in deeply, and each breath feels longer, each exhale softer, as though the night itself is guiding you toward rest. The marketplace noise you heard before has melted into silence, replaced by the faintest whisper of reeds swaying along. The Nile's edge. The river flows endlessly, but tonight it seems slower, more like a lullaby than a current. You can almost hear the gentle lap of water against the banks, steady, calming, predictable, like the rhythm of a list being checked off, line by line. The lists themselves fade too. No more chickens miscounted, no more onions argued over, no more scribes bent under the weight of Pharaoh's taxes. All that remains is the feeling they carried, the sense of order in the midst of chaos, the quiet comfort of knowing things are remembered, that nothing important is lost. That same comfort follows you now, as though invisible ink were keeping watch over you, making sure the little details of life will still be waiting tomorrow. Your steps slow, and the night around you grows softer. Stars blur gently above, no longer sharp, but glowing like warm embers. The desert wind, once harsh and dry, has turned into a cool, steady caress, brushing against your face, carrying with it the faint scent of baked bread and sweet beer. It doesn't matter if the smells are memory or dream. They are gentle, familiar, and soothing. In the distance, a torch sputters and goes out, leaving only darkness and moonlight. The sounds of workers, traders, priests, and scribes dissolve until the silence is complete. Only the Nile remains, its whisper steady, eternal, like the heartbeat of the land. You feel your own breath sinking with it, slower, deeper, until each inhale and exhale feels effortless. Your eyelids grow heavy, your body lighter. The story you've walked through, the bustling markets, the temple warehouses, the pyramid rations, the scribe's mistakes, now folds neatly away, as though rolled into a papyrus scroll and tied with cord. Safe, contained, stored. Theirs. No need to keep track anymore. The lists are finished, the tasks are done, the day is over. All that remains is rest. You are safe. The world will still be here when you wake, orderly and waiting. For now, you can let go, let the ink fade, let the torches go dark. The Nile flows on, the stars keep watch, and the lists of tomorrow can wait. Good night. Sweet dreams.